We're gonna need to start this video off with a bit of a disclaimer. The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the most controversial games of all time. On its release, and actually prior to its release, it was hit with an inescapable wave of negativity. And after people had the chance to finish it, the online wars of discussing whether this game was the second coming of Jesus or the second coming of loose skin on your finger that you try and peel away but end up ripping half your goddamn finger off instead ran rampant for months. It had some of the most unhealthy discussions I've ever seen online, which is saying a lot. So I need to make this clear from the top. I am a fan of The Last of Us Part 2. I don't think it's a perfect game, but it was tied for my personal game of the year last year with Hades, and I think it delivered in basically every way I wanted it to. If you're not a fan of The Last of Us Part 2, I can 1000% understand why. There are objective criticisms to the game, and more importantly, there's a heap of subjective criticisms that you can have. So if you do hate this game, as long as it's for legitimate reasons, I say to each his own. I understand you, but hey, maybe hang out and see if I can bring up some points that maybe change your mind. It never hurts to hear another person's perspective with stuff like this. I'll absolutely try to engage with anyone who wants to share their criticisms of the game or why they maybe hate it, but if it's just a troll or comes out of bigotry or homophobia, I'm just gonna ignore you, buddy. Okay, long disclaimer over, let's get into the video proper. In the lead up to The Last of Us Part 2, a lot of the marketing in terms of the story revolved around the cycle of violence. The game was about violence begetting violence begetting violence, a constant cycle of pain and suffering and all the other fun video game things. This kind of premise has all the makings of a douchey, pretentious tale of violence that fails to be constructive in any way and boils down to a bunch of privileged people telling us, why can't we all just get along, man? Look at all this war and racism and needless violence. Like, if we all just love each other, this would all go away. So, let's all hold hands and, like, heal the world, guys. Come on, like, we can do it. And then expecting famine and murders and the production of nuclear warheads to stop on a dime like Kendall Jenner just opened up a Pepsi can or something. Ultimately, I think The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't fall into this trap and instead tells a significantly more nuanced story. But unfortunately, a lot of people did wind up taking it at its pure face value, leading to the most popular criticism of the game's story, that is just revenge bad and that's all. I don't necessarily blame anyone for thinking that considering the circumstances, however. This is a game that a lot of people didn't think needed to exist, that the first game didn't need a sequel, and then we got these massive leaks that soured basically everyone on some of this game's most significant moments, so at that point you're playing the game and you're not even looking for subtle storytelling or deeper meanings. You're just playing it and its more obvious story beats lead to that reaffirmation that this game is a lame, basic, boring story because of your confirmation bias. This happens to me with things too. If I have a negative predisposition to something, I basically ignore all the positive parts or don't give them enough credit. So what I wanted to do in this video was actually explore these subtleties and the parallels that may have gotten overlooked by a lot of people, and to harken back to the cycle of violence, exploring the cyclical narratives of Joel, Ellie, and Abby to understand what leads us to this ending, why Ellie is not the villain, and what is The Last of Us Part 2 really about. Naturally, if we're gonna do this, we need to start with Daddy Joel. Joel's always been a fascinating character to me because it's hard to pin down exactly what type of character he is. He's certainly not a hero. He does some pretty horrible and selfish things in Part 1 is for damn sure. He's not a villain because so much of what he does is based on survival or trying to save those closest to him, and he never tries to gain power in any way. And he's not really an anti-hero either, like a lot of people seem to classify him as. Joel is not heroic. He only takes on the task of escorting Ellie so he can obtain weapons. He only continues with it because of tests, and eventually he finally starts doing the right thing and then literally dooms all of humanity for potentially the rest of its existence. Joel is just a guy in a bad situation. He's adapted to the times, he's hidden his feelings so he no longer gets hurt by this world that decided to take everything from him, and he's constantly fighting for his survival. When we first meet Joel, we're immediately endeared to him through his daughter. She seems so sweet, she clearly loves her dad, and she got him this cute ass birthday present and is so excited by it. She has this good sense of humor, he does as well. He pulls this fun little innocent prank on her. We love him, we love this man. It's crazy to think that this like 1 minute scene at the very beginning of the game is the best version of Joel we ever see for the 12 hours or so that this game takes to finish. This scene is the only reason why we like Joel for the first 6 or so hours of this journey. Objectively speaking, for the first half of this game, Joel is grumpy, always getting annoyed at people, he's doing everything just so he can get his hands on some weapons, he hates Ellie, he's just not likable in this entire section. But we like him because we see just the tiniest snippet of him being a fun and great dad, and we see that taken away from him in an instant and understand understand that life has beaten him into the person that he's become. Joel's arc in this game begins with him being a pretty damn good version of himself, and after the 20-minute intro we see him experience tragic loss and flash forward to 20 years later when he's just kind of this shell of a person. An interesting thing to note, however, is that in this first 20 minutes when shit's kinda hitting the fan but Joel hasn't experienced anything close to what he's about to for the remainder of his life, we get an important example of Joel's most defining and consistent characteristic.
Let's see what they need.
What do you think you're doing? Keep driving.
I got a kid, Joel.
So do we.
But we have room.
Hey!
Keep driving,
stop!
Tommy.
Stop!
You ain't seen what I seen. Someone else will come along.
You should have helped him.
Joel will protect his own at all costs with no care about how it could affect anyone else, always, no matter what. It's basically hard-coded into him. This choice that he made at the end of the game is not one he made because of the man the outbreak has turned him into, or one he made because he lost a daughter and refuses to lose another. This is just Joel at his absolute core, and before you type anything about how he let his guard down and trusted people in part 2 leading to his own death, put a pin in it for a hot sec. I'll get back to that in a bit. This is the trait that makes him so endearing to us, such a great father, and such a hard character to hate. But it's also the trait that ruined some of his closest relationships and prevented the ending of the hellscape that is the world of The Last of Us. This is juxtaposed with Ellie's selflessness in the original game. Her influence on him is clear. It's interesting to note how Joel ignores Sarah in the opening when she says they should have helped the people that Joel refused to pick up, but later on Ellie is able to convince him to forgive Henry because he rescued them from the water. Be it a new perspective on life or Ellie's more outspoken nature or any number of things, Ellie's selflessness is able to prevail over Joel's selfishness. And it's pretty fitting that the two moments where he becomes the most animalistic, unforgiving, and uncaring to anyone not his own in this game are the two moments when him and Ellie are separated. Now, the Joel and Ellie arc has been pretty widely covered by people before, and it's so well done that really anyone can just see it with their own eyes. You don't need me to explain it to you in depth. Basically, Ellie helps Joel learn how to love again. Joel hasn't felt love since Sarah. He pushed Tommy to the brink, and even with Tess, his partner, it's clear that love is still pretty out of the question. As Tess begs him to take Ellie to the Fireflies, the words she chooses are, "There has to be enough here for you to feel some sort of obligation to me." The person that he cares about most when we see him 20 years later, a person that he's clearly known for a long time at this point, the best we can say is enough here and sense of obligation. And then obviously by the end of this game, Joel loves Ellie in the same way that he loved Sarah. But while that's the arc we see happening on screen, there's a pretty damn huge part of this puzzle that's missing from this whole equation. The 20 years between the intro and this arc. And while this may not seem important right now, I promise it's going to be key when we discuss both Ellie and Abby's arcs in a second here. Joel's arc in The Last of Us 1 is not one of pure redemption. It's not some sort of clean bow on the story of somebody learning how to be good for the first time in 20 years, and we get this sitcom ending where even though the character has clearly done horrible things, our journey ends with everyone forgiving each other and having no lasting implications. Joel can improve and even become a good person, although that's clearly not the case at the end of this game, but no matter what he does, that doesn't absolve him from those 20 years. The 20 years when Joel was at his worst, his most monstrous, and unlike the end of this game where that monstrosity is the result of love and wanting to protect Ellie, here he was doing it out of part survival, part ruthlessness, and disregard for other people. How do I know that if the game doesn't show it? Well, let's make a list, shall we? Case number 1. In this scene that a lot of people like to bring up as a case for Joel being an incredibly distrusting person who has some sort of spidey sense for danger, we see an injured guy begging for help that Joel immediately realizes is faking it to try and get them into a vulnerable position, kill them, and take their stuff, and he tries to ass blast this dude. This wasn't just Joel having an all-seeing eye, though. The reason for why he knew this was a setup is explained very shortly after. For some reason, I can't seem to find the actual video of this conversation. I don't know why, and I'm not going to play through the entire game just to get through halfway and find this conversation, but essentially Ellie asks him how he knew that the people back there were ambushing them, and he replies, "I've been on both sides." Joel admits that he used to be one of these people, trapping, ambushing, killing, and looting unsuspecting passersby who were kind enough to help, which is a truly horrible thing to do. I understand survival, but clearly he was able to make it without needing to resort to that, and clearly other people were to a degree as well. Like, he chose to be part of these gangs that would do this to innocent people for no reason other than it was probably just the most convenient way to do things. Case number 2. When Joel meets up with Tommy in the original game, they have an argument where Joel talks about all the years during the outbreak that he took care of of Tommy. And we find out that the reason Tommy left Joel is because of the horrible methods that they'd used to survive and all of these things that they did in those years that he couldn't stomach. Now, Tommy joined the Fireflies afterwards, a group known for causing chaos and fighting back against the militia. So there's no way that Tommy was, say, really upset at the levels that they went to harm people who quote-unquote deserved it. It makes more sense that he was upset at the levels that they went to in terms of hurting and most likely murdering innocent people. We're shown in part 2 that he ran a few explosive missions for the Fireflies. Tommy isn't adverse to violence, but he does have a problem when it comes to harming people that didn't do anything to deserve it. And clearly Joel has no such hesitancy, and his cruelty and terrifying methods drove his own brother away from him. Case number 3. In part 2, we see that Tommy used the same method to torture and interrogate these dudes as Joel did in part 1, when he was trying to rescue Ellie from David. And Ellie recognizes this because she was told about it, and she even tries it out herself later. After part 1 ends, Joel lives a peaceful life in Jackson, so if Tommy and Ellie knew about this method, we'd assume it's not just because he used it one time and then told them about it afterwards. This must have been something that he did all the time, and while we can stomach his actions here because we know he's trying to find Ellie and save someone that he loves, and we also have the inside knowledge that these dudes are like straight up cannibals, we've also established that Joel didn't have very noble motivations during those 20 years, so the fact that he almost definitely pulled the same trick many times during those years, again, leads us to the conclusion that during this time, Joel Miller was an ambusher, a killer for little cause, experienced in torture tactics, and sadistic enough to drive his own family away. All for less acceptable reasons than we saw from him in the main game, and this is all just from stuff that comes up in conversation, like God knows what else he did. Joel is improved by Ellie, it's true, but as unfortunate and sad as this is, Joel is just too broken for a proper redemption. He ends the game, again, a murderer of innocence and a liar. In a normal cyclical arc, we would have seen Joel truly come back to where he was at the beginning, peaceful, a good father, a caring person once again, but the actions during this time, the length that they lasted for, the lack of remorse, never taking the initiative to be better, caused for this last section to be broken off after his big decision of saving Ellie. He almost gets that closure, that nice arc that ends where it began. He gets to be a good dad to Ellie for a while, and Ellie loves him, but it can't last, and he can't be let off the hook because of this section. Eventually, Joel's lie is found out, and once again he loses a daughter, but instead of her being tragically ripped away from him, Joel's own actions were the cause this time around. It's finally the thing that helps him understand that his overprotectiveness and complete disregard for other people in pursuit of that protectiveness is corrosive, and I think he begins to change following this moment. While he mentions on the porch that he doesn't regret saving Ellie because she means so much to him, I know he regrets lying to her and being selfish and only looking out for himself, and I think in the end allowing Ellie to break things off with him, letting her live her life, being supportive of her partners, stepping in the second anyone treated her poorly, was Joel learning how to take care of others without being selfish, finally, and he shows that to her through his actions. That's the end of Joel's personal arc, but soon we're gonna see how it continues in spirit. Okay, now I know we're getting a little long here and we haven't talked about Abby or Ellie yet, but I also wanted to quickly touch on this so people don't try and pick apart my argument. A natural objection here is saying, hey, if Joel's most consistent character trait is him taking care of himself and his own above all else, why does he risk his neck out to help Abby and also trust her? Well, like I said, Joel finally learns how to do this without being selfish at this point, and on top of that, Joel is not a straight up mistrusting person. He trusts Henry just because he's got a kid with him. Like, he trusts him enough to sleep in the same room as him after just meeting the guy. Abby wasn't trying to set up Joel here, she was legitimately in danger, so it's not like Joel fell for anything, he just helped someone in need. Well, why did he not question her being there and all of her friends being camped out so close to Jackson? Well, Joel hasn't done anything to piss anyone off in 4 years. I doubt he thinks in his own head that people are gonna track him down after all this time. Also, they mentioned that people came by the town a lot, traders looking to exchange goods and just people traveling through the area. It's a common thing. Well, okay, but why did he go with her in the first place to her hideout? Well, there were a lot of zombies. I don't know if you could tell, but seriously, they're backed up against a wall and they say that Jackson's gonna be hard to make in the storm and Abby's place is a lot closer and they can actually make it there. Okay, well, why tell him his actual name? If he just used a fake name, he would have been fine. Well, again, he has no reason to believe these people are hunting him or have anything to do with him. Like I said, he doesn't have spider senses. He only knew about this ambush thing because he's personally done it to people before. Plus, Tommy already told Abby their names back in the cabin, which is in line with his character. He's always been more trusting and looks towards helping people more than Joel does, and telling Abby their names was definitely him just trying to comfort her and make her feel more relaxed. Tommy doing that makes sense, so Abby knew either way. Joel could have said his name was George Costanzo II. She still would have shot him, okay? Anyways, my rant is over. I've been holding on to that for a year. and I finally got to get it out. Anyways, let's talk about Abby. Abby's arc is shown to us in a much different order than we see Joel's. Joel's chronology endeared us to him, helped us understand who he became, and also why he made the choice that he did at the end. Abby's arc starts here, her most villainous moment, at her being a monster. And to cap it all off, her victim is a beloved character of ours, so needless to say, people felt a bit different about Abby than they felt about Joel. But what is Abby's full arc? Stop me if you've heard this before. She starts off pretty innocent, her life is as good as it can be during the apocalypse, she seems like a stand-up gal and has a strong relationship with a member of her family, and all of a sudden, that family member is tragically taken away from her and she grieves. And following this, she becomes more of a shell of herself. She loses sight of other relationships and morals and everything and becomes a significantly worse version of herself. She becomes villainous. Eventually, she develops a new relationship with someone with a bit more innocence and she begins to regain her humanity, becoming caring again, slowly moving back to where she was before, and then all of a sudden, something happens that pulls her back into her old ways. Okay, now pause. Beat for beat, this is basically the exact same thing that Joel goes through. And Video Game Donkey actually pointed that out in his video where he mentioned the Abby section of this game is essentially a recreation of the original Last of Us. But it is super important to mark the differences between the two arcs because they ultimately changed the ending. Number 1, Abby's caretaker died, not somebody that she was taking care of. This is important because Abby's dad did instill certain extra things in her. He was a doctor and a caring person, and while Abby didn't become a nurse or a doctor, we can see that she knows how to set a yoinked arm back in place, and she knows a good deal about what Mel is referring to when they're discussing Yara's arm, which is a great way to show how elements of her dad live on through her. Joel ignored Sarah saying that they should have helped the family at the beginning of the first game, and it's a good example of how these relationships are different. Joel raised Sarah, she didn't teach him how to be good. Abby's father taught her those things, and while that doesn't stop her from doing some terrible stuff, it does affect a few things moving forward, including number 2, she helps Yara and Lev out of the goodness of her heart, not because she's forced to. Initially, they're thrust into each other's lives and just survive together, but Abby takes them to safety, sets Yara's arm, and gives them advice. Her nightmares of her dad continue just like they did before she killed Joel. She doesn't have closure, so she goes out of her way to find Yara and Lev again and then makes a full journey to gather supplies to help with Yara's arm. Joel was forced into his relationship with Ellie, but Abby chose to help Yara and Lev, and even face some of her biggest fears for their sakes, and what happens after she helps them. She finally dreams of her dad alive and happy. Her dad was a doctor, a caretaker, somebody who wanted to cure the world and somebody who instilled that onto his daughter. It's only fitting that she doesn't feel like she's done him proud by murdering someone, she instead feels that way when she's finally carried on that legacy. Her father affects her into becoming a better person after her vision stops being fogged by the pursuit of revenge, something that Joel didn't have, and even if Sarah's memory could have made him a better person, he went on too long in this state for it to have mattered. Number 3, Abby has friends throughout this entire process of grieving, and while she neglects them often and they also enable her unhealthy behavior during this time frame, having people in her corner makes a huge difference over Joel, who only had Tommy in a much more unstable environment where they were surviving on their own with minimal resources. And finally, number 4, unlike in the original game where Ellie's absence can be pinpointed as a huge reason why Joel ultimately made his contentious decision at the end, which led to his shattered arc, sealing the fact that he could never be fully redeemed in the end, Lev is actually there when Abby is about to make her relapse decision. Abby has her newfound humanity staring her in the face, asking her not to commit an act of horrific and sadistic violence, and she listens. She leaves Ellie and Dina alone, completing the arc that Joel left broken. She ends the game looking for the Fireflies, trying to be a force for good again, and taking care of Lev. She finally goes back to a version of her old self without any major caveats. We should note that basically every place where we differ from Joel's story, which leads us to a much better result, is because of the people around Abby. Her role models, her friends, her sources of light after she turned to the dark, and how present they are when she nearly turns back to it. Abby isn't necessarily a better person than Joel just because she completes this arc. She's not some saint who's never done anything wrong. She just had better surroundings, better support, and more fortunate circumstances. And would you look at that, all of these things are even more present in the arc of another character. Can you guess who it is? Can you? Ellie. Yeah, it's Ellie. I'm not even gonna play coy. This video is long enough already. Ellie in this story is in an entirely different part of our main character story arc than we see Joel in the first game and Abby in during her section of the second game. Once again, we have our character living pretty peacefully. They're chilling about as much as they can given the circumstances, and then boom. Joel isn't Ellie's birth father, but for all intents and purposes, this is a close family member of Ellie being suddenly taken away from her. And unlike Joel's 20 years that were hidden from us and Abby's 4 years that we see the worst of and then move past, Ellie's side fully explores underscores this descent into a more villainous character. I think this is where the confusion comes in when people claim that Abby ended up being the good guy and Ellie was the villain. All three of these characters went through the exact same thing, we're just seeing Ellie's unfold in real time, which is the difference. And in fact, I think that Ellie's arc actually winds up looking like the nicest one of the three, and better yet, it ensures that no arcs like this continue past this point. I mentioned how Abby's dad dying rather than Joel's daughter dying makes a big difference when it comes to the deceased party having any sort of positive impact on the character, and the same thing can be seen here. Ellie's father figure dies, and although their relationship was strained, the impact that he had on her is still significant. Like I mentioned earlier, Joel's best trait, his need to take care of people close to him, was finally devoid of the selfishness that made it so dangerous in this porch scene, and also throughout the past 2 years at that point. A lot like Abby being blind to what her father would have wanted from her following his death due to a rage, Ellie is blind to the things that Joel has taught her due to rage. Dina gets pregnant and Ellie's like, I don't care, I'm going to kill Abby, you can chill here, we're not going back. Tommy's in trouble, we said we'd get him and get out before we all get killed. Nope, sorry, you go help Tommy, I don't give a flying fuck, I want to go kill Abby. Dina and her are raising a kid together, she's supportive and understanding and Ellie is happy, and after hearing where Abby is, Dina begs Ellie to stay and she says, nope, sorry, I gotta go kill Abby. In the exact opposite fashion of Joel, Ellie neglects those closest to her because she can't see how in the wrong she is. Ellie has better friends than Abby does. I think it was a conscious decision to have Abby's friends be a bit more in the gray and have Tommy be so caring and looking out for Ellie. Dina always being by her side and helping her out even when she's pregnant and sick and can't get up and help Ellie fight. Jesse coming all of this way on his own to support her, and then also later on coming back to her after she told him to basically screw off while he was being the sensible one, just to make sure that she was okay. Ellie had good people around her the whole time, and her decisions led to their devastation, damages, and even death. And she still couldn't see that this wasn't what she should be doing. And then finally, after all of that, after she descends in the same way the others descended and is about to hit a point of making a mistake that would inevitably lead to her own death, just like Joel set himself up and Abby set herself up, as she wins, she remembers Joel. For Abby, she wasn't able to see clearly what would bring her closure until after she made the mistake, but like I said, Ellie has better people in her life, and Joel's trait of taking care of people has directly affected Ellie and has dictated so much of their relationship. In this moment, Ellie's won, she's avenged Joel, and in that same instant, I think she wonders what happens now that she has won. Dina won't talk to her again, her relationship with Tommy will no matter what never go back to what it was before. She can't just go back to Jackson's, so I guess she starts a new life. And while she probably doesn't think of this next part, we know more than likely in this world she'll find someone that brings her humanity back, but Lev is gonna be after her. We go back to the same rhythm and the same cycle, but if she doesn't win, maybe she can go back to Dina. Show her that ultimately Dina and JJ were more important to her than avenging Joel, and even though she didn't realize it sooner, maybe, just maybe, Dina can forgive her. In this moment, we see the porch scene, the scene that represents Joel's protectiveness void of selfishness, and before it's too late, Ellie realizes that it's more important for her to carry on that legacy, to care for her own rather than pursue a selfish crusade, and she knows that if she completes this act, that can never truly happen. I don't think Ellie let Abby go because she cared in any way about Abby. I think she let her go because of the impact that Joel had on her that made her better, made her care for her own in the same way that he did, and in the instant that she won, the dust cleared and she finally understood that. Joel without Ellie made a bad decision. Abby without Lev would have done the same thing, but luckily he was there, and Ellie was able to gather the willpower to do it herself. At the end of the game, we see Ellie wearing Dina's bracelet, meaning she either intends on finding her or, as some have speculated, already reconnected with her and is just going back to the farm for her things. Throughout the whole game, the guitar represents the one thing connecting Ellie to Joel, but eventually this physical connection is replaced by an emotional one. Joel departs a more positive version of a trait we've seen since the opening minutes of the first game, and in that way, I think The Last of Us 2's ending is significantly more happy than a lot of people, including myself, had originally believed. All three of these characters are put on the same path, but they all end a bit different, a bit better than the last, eventually breaking the cycle of violence. And while at the surface that conclusion might seem like The Last of Us 2 is a narrative simply about revenge being bad and that we should stop it, I think the much bigger takeaway is, how do we affect each other? What do we learn from one another? How do our environments, our role models, our relationships shape us into who we are and what we can become? And that even if we've done some bad things and will surely face their consequences, we can make an impact on someone else. Joel wasn't able to undo what he did in those 20 years, and he wasn't able to escape the repercussions, but his improvements and efforts to be good again weren't in vain, because they led to him imparting the best part of himself onto his daughter, and made sure that ultimately she didn't make the same mistakes that he did. In a beautiful way, The Last of Us Part 2 is Joel finally making the world just a slightly better place. Thank you guys for watching. This is the longest video I've done. It took me a lot of time to write, and it still ended up being a bit scattered because I'm pushing through a bit of a writer's block right now. But if you watched it all the way through to the end, I really appreciate it. If you could leave a like or a comment or something about what you thought about this video, that would be super awesome. If you're new and you watched it all the way, hey, subscribe. I make a lot of stuff and it's all about video games, so check out the description for some playlists. Head on over to the channel, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time. Peace.